welcome us onto the land and that we reside on, that we're currently for our visiting. And so welcome to the panel, Explorations and Empirical Posthumanisms. Thank you. Immediately before we even introduce the speakers, our speakers graciously joined us from around the world today. There's a set of problems to address regarding the title. And I talked about this before. I want to give this another go. And it starts with the concept of explorations. And it bears a certain weight. To speak at the beginning, to explore, it bears a certain weight from the history of science and colonialism. It's aligned with such concepts like discovery or findings or objectives, the persistent scientisms that underlie our current education system and research objectives. It has kind of a means-end rationality to it. And it's hardly the kind of word for a panel on something so renegade as to warrant a post in front of its title. And the history of exploration, though, is an interesting one. I mean, it has the connotation of an exploratory politics, such as the activity involved in colonialist expansion. Well, simultaneously, it's a concept that befits expanding the body of knowledge by exploring the boundaries of speculation so as to widen the periphery of what can be known about nature and the natural order, or disorder, entropy. And it's a concept that's made a kind of a triumphant return within sociology and the social sciences. So we think less than 10 years ago, I think, with Richard Swedberg's influential work in the British Journal of Sociology, who's a contemporary pragmatist and empirical sociologist who celebrates this context of discovery under which new theories are being written. Now, explorations in posthumanism, or on empirical posthumanism, the word "in," when the title says explorations in posthumanism, it implies that the empirical posthumanism already exists. And each of us on these screens is in a place, like we're in an office. So we're talking about earlier being in a kitchen, or in a car, or in a living room, in a park. And can we really be in a place other than when we know where it is that we're in? Because to be in something also implies a kind of mental comfort level. We know that when we're in thought, or we're in an argument, or we're in the moment, or we're in trouble, we know what the trouble is, we're resonating deeply with that place on an embodied level, right? Heidegger had written something that this latter mode of the in was an existential mode of becoming involved. And so how can we explore in something when we know what exploration does is discover a difference? And next, this whole concept of the empirical, another controversial term. It's a tradition tied to some of the more problematic figures in Western philosophy with whom posthumanism has its difficulties. We tend to tie the notion of empirics to John Locke and Berkeley and Hume, and assume that a commitment to the empirical is a commitment to the dogmatic fact. It belongs to a process that was able to disentangle what an object may have smelled or tasted like and turned it into a quality with a consistent substance. So often humanities scholars attack Descartes and the mind-body split, but the tradition of separating substances from qualities is equally offensive to us. And empiricism, especially blind empiricism, still haunts our social sciences departments, where qualitative and post-qualitative, arts-based and experimental methodologies are still somewhat in the minority. And lastly, we have posthumanisms. And those of us who arrived at the shores of posthumanisms arrived in a multi-perspectival horizon. From within anthropology and zoology, sociology, musicology, architecture, posthumanism has some pretty alluring and affirmative sets of practices with which I think many of us are familiar. And at the root of it, we see an affirmative set of methodologies whose purpose is to de-center human exceptionalism and gain a greater appreciation for the way in which humans persist through their ecological networks, rather than over them or around them. And if posthumanists are limited to empirical generalizations, those empiricisms are porous and multiple, shifting temporal dynamics according to the disciplinary and philosophical experience of the experiencer. And with that, the answer to the problem of the title, I think, is that posthumanisms revisit the terms of the Enlightenment, but try to discard the political weight of the human as an autonomous, free-thinking agent responsible for a self-made destiny. And this is what we're exploring today as we talk about the force of interruption, the socio-political agency of plants, and the empathies of policy. And what these empirics share in common is that they're non-human forces. And so our presenters today are going to be in the same order as we determined last time, with Andrew Brooks from UNSW, and Sarah Elton from X University, and from Nick Fox from Huddersfield. And so Andrew is research proposes strategies for reading and listening to contemporary media systems, events, and infrastructures. And his current research is organized around three main projects: around the politics of noise and listening, infrastructural inequalities, and the politics of race and embodiment in media culture. And with his paper, Murmur, Noise Beyond Representation. Thank you, Andrew, and take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and what a wonderful introduction. Thanks, Mickey, and thanks to everyone for being here. I want to say also, just to begin with, that I'm joining from unceded Wongal land in the inner west of Sydney. This always was and it always will be Aboriginal land. I want to acknowledge elders past and present for the continued care of the beautiful country I'm on today, and acknowledge the many resistances to colonialism that are still ongoing in this context. So thank you. It's great to be here. I'm going to give a short paper that's part of a longer project and a larger project on noise, but really noise as a way of thinking through collectivity beyond a kind of identitarianism, I suppose. So outside of the individual and yes, very much kind of challenging and interrupting this concept of the human. It begins with an epigraph from W.E.B. Du Bois. He muttered to me with the murmur of many ages. If 2020 was a year defined by the massive reorganization of life brought about by the COVID-19 pandemic, then it will surely also be remembered for the most extensive and intensive riots to have swept across the US since the late 1960s. Responding to the death-dealing anti-blackness of policing in the US, the murder of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer on 25th of May being, at the time, the most recent instance, the noise of the uprising spread across the country and then around the world, taking the form of solidarity actions and protests over the theft of Black life in other contexts, including here in the settler colony of Australia, where Black Indigenous life meets the violent eliminatory logics of policing. It is misleading to say that this noise has subsided, incorrect to suggest that because we can no longer hear the sounds of broken windows and shattered glass, of screams and shouts, of voices emerging from and folding back into a collective din, that this noise no longer choreographs the movement of the world. Noise is, of course, not merely an audible phenomenon, but implies a vibrational movement that is irreducibly social, in that nothing escapes contact with its material force. The unpredictable and incessant vibration of noise refuses individuation by bringing matter into relation with other matter. Oh, sorry, just give me 1 sec. My neighbor just... Sorry. Oh, sorry, I'm just on the tour. Is that right? Yeah. Thanks. I'm so sorry. Something's happening in my street and my neighbor needs to move my car. Let me continue. The larger project that this short talk is connected to asks how we might think the continuity between expressions of noise that respond to the material conditions of our present, including ongoing Indigenous dispossession, widespread deindustrialization, mass underemployment and employment insecurity, widespread austerity, rising costs of living, the intensification of policing and incarceration, and repressive forms of state violence, as well as a metaphysical understanding of noise as a medial material and an expression of difference, possibility, and transformation. To do so requires that we conceptualize noise simultaneously as material, social, and aesthetic, as that which both precedes and exceeds structures like race, class, gender, and sexuality. We must therefore conceptualize noise in relation to colonialism and racial capitalism to consider how it forms and reforms, how it is shaped by these world historical processes, and how it exceeds them. So today I want to think through noise as a figure. I think about noise through the figure of the murmur, which I suggest offers a way outside the possessive logics and univocity that define settler sovereignties and subjectivities. A murmur is a boundless, layered sonic indeterminacy, both continuous and dispersed. The coalescing of many discrete sounds into a noisy mass that lacks a definite or clearly identifiable structure, a murmur is inherently multiple. Consider the commonly invoked murmur of the crowd, in which many disparate voices are drawn together in a movement that is always in excess of the individual speaking subject. The murmur is defined not by constancy, but according to a relentless movement that implies differentiation and change. The murmuring crowd cannot be reduced to an expression of univocality, even if it momentarily concretizes around collective cries such as "whose streets, our streets," or "no justice, no peace, no racist police." Such enunciations always dissolve back into a heterogeneous and multivocal noise that complicates the ordering of its sound into a meaningful figure that occupies a foreground and supportive background of the noise against which it is organized. This figure, the murmur, suggests an endless trading of places between signal and noise, speech and sound, inside and outside, figure and field. Edward Glissant understood the centrality of noise when he wrote, "Noise is essential to speech, din is discourse." Resonant with Glissant, Michel Serres figures noise as the conditioning turbulence of the universe, a field of potentiality that conditions the actual. His account of noise is indebted to the cosmological materialism of Lucretius, who describes a vibrational turbulence produced by the aleatory swerve, what he calls the clinamen, of atoms, and the world-making and world-breaking potentiality of this movement. Noise is a turbulence, writes Serres. It is order and disorder at the same time, order revolving on itself through repetition and redundancy, disorder through chance occurrences, the drawing of lots at the crossroads, and through the global meandering, unpredictable and crazy. Serres describes this foundational turbulence as a background noise, but his use of the term requires some clarification. The background does not refer to that which has been pushed away by the foreground, but rather to a continuous, indeterminate conditioning from which phenomena emerge. Noise is present in everything, and everything is formed out of noise. He writes, "We are surrounded by noise, and this noise is inextinguishable. It is outside, it is the world itself, and it is inside, produced by our living body. We are in the noises of the world. We cannot close our door to their reception, and we evolve, rolling in this incalculable swell." So noise exists in and between every entity and every event. We are immersed in it, and there is no possibility of being outside it, even though it is also outside of us. Noise is the meta medium through which any message must pass, the channeling that makes the transmission of any signal possible, a figure of pure mediality. Such noise signifies an excess of meaning rather than a lack. Between yes and no, between 0 and 1, an infinite number of values appear, and thus an infinite number of answers, Serres tells us. Here we might conceptualize noise as a materiality that interrupts the dualism that dominates Western epistemologies, functioning through the cumulative and conjunctive logic of both and rather than the binary logic of either or. But one cannot tell the story of noise without also speaking of the ongoing attempts to control it. The story of noise is a story of social relations, which, as Marx teaches us, is also a story of the imposition of the capital relation and its internal drive toward accumulation. Coloniality and the development of the capitalist world system requires both the enclosure of indigenous lands and the enslavement of people to extract value from those lands. The so-called primitive accumulation that Marx described as a precondition for the emergence of industrial capitalism is, in fact, an ongoing process of dispossession that relies upon the production and exploitation of categorical distinctions. As Cedric Robinson shows us, there is no separation between an understanding of capitalism grounded in the production of surplus value through the economic exploitation of wage labour and those violent modes of coercion and dispossession that continue to enable contemporary modes of accumulation, but which are sometimes relegated to a preceding stage in the narration of history. The development of capitalism has always relied upon the production of modes of differentiation, such as race, gender, and sexuality, and capitalism's continued expansion relies upon ever-expanding fields of appropriation and dispossession, both abstractly and materially. The production of binaries that become central to the legitimation of colonial and capitalist violence occur not merely in the domains of philosophical or juridical discourse, but also in the aesthetic realm. The sonic is inextricably bound to such possessive claims, and in the archives of colonialism, we can find a concerted attempt to racialize noise, an attempt to fix it in place as that which requires controlling. The act of claiming possession by an invading colonial empire often involves a performative sonic act, a declaration or a proclamation, the sounding of cannons or the beating of drums. Of the acoustic dimension to the possessive claim exerted by English colonists in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607, the historian Richard Cullen Rath reports that they let loose a ritualized fanfare of trumpets as part of the process of legitimating their claim upon the land for colony and king. The claiming of the place now known as the Australian settler colony is also yoked to a sonic event. On the 22nd of August, 1770, James Cook anchored the HMS Endeavour in the Torres Strait at the north end of the Australian east coast. It is said that some of the crew rowed ashore to Bedanung, or what Cook subsequently renamed Possession Island, a small island home that is part of the lands of the Koreg, Gudang, Yandiku, and Akamuthi peoples, where they planted a flag and fired 3 shots of a musket, which were returned by shots of the ship's cannon. The echo of that act created the conditions for the establishment of the colony some 18 years later, and the violence of which continues today. The ability to claim possession then relies upon the racialized dismissal of those who are dispossessed. In the hands of early colonists and Enlightenment thinkers, noise is made to signify primitivity, an index of the incapacity to possess either self or land. The racialization of noise, Ashen T. Crawley notes, is part of the larger process of racialization that crystallized in the Enlightenment period. He writes that sound was made distinct from noise, and after such categorical distinction, noise in general became racialized as the other of Europe, as the other of rationality, as the other of the proper. Made synonymous with indigeneity and blackness, noise is rendered as that which must be contained and controlled through the supposedly civilizing project of conquest and settlement. The separation from sound and noise and the mapping of this binary onto rationality and irrationality, self-possession and dispossession, constitutes an attempt to fix a materiality defined by irreducible difference to a static representation. And now I'm coming to the final section of this short paper. The attempt then to contain the uncontainable, that is to contain noise or difference, which noise is ultimately an expression of in this Sayrezian reading, has produced a litany of miseries and violence, the dispossession of indigenous people from their sovereign lands and the transformation of subjects into chattel, the exploitation of group-based difference for labour-based exploitation, and so on. Indeed, the transcendental subject of Enlightenment thought can be understood as one who has the capacity to transcend noise and whose speech takes the form of a singular and univocal demand. What Jacques Rancière calls the realm of the sensible turns on the ability to distinguish between speech and noise. If there is someone you do not wish to recognize as a political being, he tells us, you begin by not seeing them as bearers of politicalness, by not understanding what they say, by not hearing that it is an utterance coming out of their mouths. He argues that politics consists of requalifying these categories, of getting what was only audible as noise to be heard as speech. Quote. But what if what is actually required is an anti-politics rather than a redistributive politics, in which the dispossessed struggle to gain access to social structures and social wealth that have been made possible through their constitutive exclusion? To turn away from man and the possessive individualism that defines such a figure might be to turn back toward the turbulence and the sociality of the murmur. In his archaeology of the Black radical tradition, Cedric Robinson points out that the attempts of the slave traders and colonists to impose brutal forms of cultural imperialism on the enslaved were always partial and incomplete. He tells us that the cargoes of laborers that were shipped across the Middle Passage also contained African cultures, critical mixtures and admixtures of language and thought, of cosmology and metaphysics, of habits, beliefs, and morality. These were the actual terms of their humanity. End quote. The murmur of many ages, to borrow a phrase from W.E.B. Du Bois, moved in the hold of the ship as an excess that could not be contained. A different yet resonant murmur of many ages moves in and through the First Nations that continue to assert their sovereignty and resist the dispossessive force of the colonial world-making project. Such murmurs unsettle the historicity of coloniality, that is, the production of a linear and teleological narration of history by a transcendental subject. Eileen Morton Robinson speaks of First Nations sovereignty as incommensurable with that of the sovereignty imposed by settler states, which is derived from a political, theological, juridical tradition which presumes a supreme authority and exerts a possessive claim. The secularization of sovereignty, Morton Robinson tells us, does nothing to trouble this ontology, reinscribing the supreme authority of the monarch in a conception of the nation state as that which is self-contained. Settler sovereignty cannot deal with the sovereignty that precedes it. It can only resolve the question of ownership through juridical systems that accept the nation state as a self-contained authority. As Patrick Wolfe puts it, the question of it, the settler state's own externality, is simply and literally beyond its power. Indigenous sovereignty, Morton Robinson argues, cannot be thought through the lens of the Westphalian tradition, but must be taken on the terms set out by First Nation people. Indigenous sovereignty suggests nothing short of a different world, one both anti and ante, the one we currently live in, the possibility of a world outside of the teleological narration of colonial history. She writes, "Our ontologies, our ways of being Indigenous, are inextricably connected to being in and of our lands. This is an inherent sovereignty not temporally constrained. It functions through the logics of relativity, finding expression in kin relations, respect, responsibility, and obligation that exist outside the logic of capital and familial ties to private property and nation states." The one-year writer, Alexis Wright, expands this notion of sovereignty into an orientation, describing what she calls the sovereignty of the mind and spirit that endures despite the violence of colonial occupation. The sovereign consciousness, in other words, exists on an otherwise world. The noise that carries through the ages also carries with it the possibility of forms of relationality with each other and with place and with environment. And these forms of relationality might escape the extractive and appropriative logics of colonialism and capitalism. This, of course, is not to presume that I, as a settler living on Black, unceded land, have the ancestral knowledge that Wright speaks of. Rather, it is to suggest that noise offers a way to hold irreducible differences in relation and without resolution. The materiality of noise produces the possibility of an encounter that registers in and on the flesh. This registration is what Denise Ferreira da Silva calls affectability, which she tells us is defined by relationality, contingency, and immediacy. Affectability is that which enables forms of solidarity grounded in what Da Silva refers to as difference without separability, and which she argues is central to ending the grip of time and restoring the world anew. Crawley makes the point more directly in his own study of the fugitive nature of noise, and I quote, to make it joyfully is to criticize the epistemology of Western civilization, to critique the coloniality of being, power, truth, freedom, to perform an intervention into the object, the theme, the transcendental subject of history. And so I want to conclude by suggesting that the multiplicity of the murmur contains within it what Fred Moten and Stefano Hani refer to as a call for and from disorder. To embrace the vibrational force of excess given in this call for and from disorder is to refuse an investment in individuation in favor of an embrace of the possibility offered by the multiple. In the murmur, we might locate something like an anti-politics, or what Hani and Merton call the general and generative antagonism. The general antagonism, they write, looms outside every attempt to politicize, every imposition of self-governance, every sovereign decision and its degraded miniature, every emergent state, and home sweet home. To embrace the multiplicity of the murmur, its vibrational sociality and irreducible difference, might be one way to forge solidarities that register shared investments in disrupting and escaping the categorical distinctions that underpin the violence of colonialism and racial capitalism, without collapsing the differential ways that such structures bear down on different people. The swerve, excess, difference, possibility, the materiality and sociality of noise offers one way of attuning to a horizon beyond the one we currently inhabit. Thank you.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Andrew. Andrew, that was brilliant, and I had a little script in front of me telling you where you're from and stuff, and then I had UNSW written down. I completely blanked on what UNSW stood for right there. So yeah, Andrew's from University of New South Wales, or known as UNSW Sydney. I really need a script for my talk. Sarah Elton from X University, which is Sarah, maybe you can help me with this when you present. But X University is a designation that it currently has, as that university is transitioning from Ryerson, because Ryerson was named after one of the architects of the residential school system. And X University, for those who aren't familiar, is the status that I think it's an unofficial status now. Correct me if I'm wrong, but as it's transitioning towards possibly a renewed name that is more bespeaking of the reconciliation that is being undertaken in Canada right now. And Sarah is writing to us from the perspective of critical food systems. And she looks at, we were just talking about this before, looking at the food biosphere health nexus and it looks like modes of resistance of of food preparation. A lovely kind of very grounded, concrete research for that reason. And looking at the impact now of COVID-19 on Canadian food systems. She's looking at a research project on that tracks the impact of the pandemic on the Ontario Food Terminal, which is Canada's largest wholesale market of fresh produce sources food for Toronto and Ontario and the Maritimes. And that study is funded by X University's Faculty of Arts Research Awards. Doctoral work that she'd done before examined the relationships between humans and non-human nature in urban gardens in Toronto, and won the 2019-2020 Joe Meakin Award for Methodological Excellence in Qualitative Doctoral Dissertation. And her presentation today, I invited her after reading some of her stuff on plants, and her paper today is Relational Health, Theorizing Plants as Health Supporting Actors. Thank you, Sarah.
Thanks, Mickey, and thanks, Andrew, for your talk going first. So my name is Sarah Elton. I'm a critical qualitative health researcher, and as Mickey just said, I do work on food systems, and I'm joining you from Toronto. This is Mississauga Territory 13. It's the traditional shared gathering grounds of the Haudenosaunee Nations through the Dish with One Spoon Treaty and the historical home of the Wendat Nation. And in this part of the world where I live, a Euro-Western ontology has dominated for arguably about 150 years. And this Euro-Western ontology has shaped the way that society here in what we now call Canada interacts with non-human nature, with a profound impact on the land. For much longer than that, for time immemorial, an indigenous ontology has shaped the way that humans have lived in relationship with nature, non-human nature. And part of that ontology, I have been learning as a settler from reading the works by indigenous scholars such as Genius and Kahete, is that indigenous peoples on Turtle Island have thought of plants as kin, as medicine, and as world makers. So I want to situate my work on human-plant relations in the context of these indigenous ontologies. So these are sophisticated knowledge systems that long precede post-humanist thought. In contrast, Euro-Western worldview has largely erased plants from society's consciousness. This has been termed plant blindness by Wandersee and Schlusser. It stops people from recognizing the important role that plants play in society. So of interest to me as a food and health scholar is that Euro-Western society does not recognize plants as health supporting. Today I'm going to play around with some post-humanist theory, and I'm going to draw on my empirical work to theorize people-plant relations in the production of health. I think about human-plant relations in 3 sites. In the vegetable garden, I'll be talking about that today. More recently, in produce supply chains, and I am considering those also from a post-humanist perspective as well, and also the gut, the human gut. So these are all sites where plants produce health in relation. So let's define post-humanism. It's not something I like to do, actually, because it's complicated. I have cited Fox and Aldred, Nick Fox and Pam Aldred frequently when I attempt to do this, but I've been confronted with so many questions about how does one actually even define post-humanism. But I'm going to draw out some key themes today. So I work with post-humanist theory to consider the implications of seeing humans as equal to all non-human life forms and systems, to disrupt really what Kim Tallbear calls the settler-colonial nature-culture binary. Val Plumwood calls it a dualism. And so this binary or this dualism not only separates humans from nature, but creates a hierarchical relationships between man, and I use man with a capital M, as does Sylvia Wynter in her work, with man at the top of the hierarchy. And this relegates nature and everyone associated with nature, including women, racialized and indigenous people, to an inferior position, as Sylvia Wynter has explained in detail in her writing. So, post-humanism decenters the human. It places the human on the same ontological plane as plants, as animals, and other life forms and systems that make up the biosphere. Post-humanism recognizes that humans are inextricably connected to non-human nature, well, that humans are nature. And post-humanism recognizes that nature is not inert. Non-human nature is not inert, and that the things in this non-human nature, they have agency. They can make things happen. They can cause effects. And this agency is relational. So, and I'll get back to that in just a few minutes, relational agency. But why plants? Well, plants have been fundamental to the Euro-Western colonial project that continues to unfold in today's global industrial food system. Europe's financial interest in plants has, of course, fueled the expansion of empire since the late 15th century, and scholars such as Beskey and Padway have explored how people have partnered with plants like sugarcane, like wheat, coffee, tea, cotton, to colonize, to oppress, to extract, to accumulate, and this continues to this day. So that's what interests me in plants, especially plants in those commodity chains. But plants are also intimate companions to the participants in my study in Toronto, in gardens. So there are many types of plants, and there are many types of relationships that people have with plants. Head et al. Aim to describe these relationships with their term vegetal politics. And this is a concept that they introduced to capture the political role that plants can play. In the social sciences and humanities, there is this burgeoning plant turn that looks at plants in society. So scholars like Sophie Chow are an example of this plant turn. And these images in this slide connect California almond trees, plants, with nut sellers in Old Delhi, where I took this photograph. And so this image connects the legacy of Great Britain's colonial project with the in India with the settler colonialism in the United States. And the reason I selected this image of this deli shop selling California almonds is that it is a snapshot from the multi-species contact zone that is the global industrial food system that really forms the background of all my work. Oops. Sorry about that. I think I've gone back. So I studied human-plant relations in vegetable gardens, including community gardens and the allotment gardens. Sorry, I'm just... Okay, sorry, I apologize. I need to just... There we are. Okay.
There we go.
So plants are important to health. Plants help us to breathe, eat. They provide clothes for our materials and shelter. Plants are fuel, our machines. And the human relationships with plants is a perfect example of relational health. So relational health, as I have defined it in my Social Science and Medicine article, recognizes that we would not breathe, we would not eat or live without the myriad of life forms and ecosystems of the biosphere. So everything from microbes, animals, soil systems, plants. In a relational health view, health is a constantly unfolding process that is produced through encounters between humans and non-humans. So there are many scholars exploring these linkages in the social sciences. We know that when species meet, sometimes the outcome is not very good. We only need to think of, well, COVID, zoonotic disease, also like Lyme disease. These are diseases that are produced between encounters between humans and non-humans. So I don't want to lionize these relationships between humans and non-human nature. However, mostly encounters are positive. So this idea of health produced through relationships between humans and non-humans stands in contrast to conventional understandings of health in our Euro-Western institutions. So in terms of health and food, these conventional understandings are as follows. Biomedical frame. So that is, food is good for me because it is good for my body. It's about nutrition. The food access frame, where health is considered in terms of food security and insecurity at an individual, at a community, at a population level. Then there's the food environment frame, which thinks of health in terms of the foodscape, the retail foodscape, what's sometimes described as, and I quote, an obesogenic environment. That's from Egger and Swinburne. And that is what they call, quote, a pathological environment in terms of limited opportunities, providing limited opportunities for people to move, to get places without a car, poor quality of food. And I know that none of these three frames actually consider non-human nature. Of course, there are scholarly approaches that do connect human health to that of ecosystems and non-humans, for example, planetary health and One Health. There are two examples. However, it has been observed by other scholars that these approaches have had marginal impact on mainstream public health and medicine. So hence the need for a post-humanist intervention. The garden is one of my favorite sites. So I study human-plant relations in urban vegetable gardens, including community gardens and allotment gardens like the one on the slide here. The garden, in my view, is part of a non-market food economy where food is grown and distributed outside of these capitalist relations of the market economy, and it's worthy of study. I argue that in gardens, where I conducted a multi-species ethnography, I argue that plants are health actors. So plant agency is not the same as human agency. Of course, we know that plants are not like us, so they don't act with intent. Rather, plants have agency because they influence, they shape, they determine, they block, they make things happen. Plant agency was manifested in my study through relationships in the community vegetable garden. So plants in the vegetable garden produce food, healthy food that people don't have to pay for because they can grow it themselves. And the participants I interviewed in my study reported to me that just growing a garden supported their mental health. And also it supported their physical health because gardening keeps you active. And the literature on gardening supports this. And then, conversely, the plants depend on the humans. They depend on the gardeners for water, for soil, for care, for weeding. The gardeners and the plants exist together in health-supporting relationships. And it is from this interdependence between people and plants that the plant's agency emerges in the city. Part of the fieldwork I conducted was in a neighborhood that is being redeveloped from an exclusively state-funded social housing community that is part of the Toronto Community Housing Corporation. It has been transformed, it's in the process, it's still ongoing, from a mixed income area from a exclusively social housing area. So if you can see my cursor moving, this is what the old neighborhood looks like. It's the part that's still left. And it's being transformed into this, a mixed income area with a high amount of private ownership condos. It's 69 acres of downtown, right near my university, valuable real estate in a gentrifying city. It also is a neighborhood where people have grown food for decades. And so to remake the neighborhood involved building these new condos on some of the vegetable gardens, including right here are some of the vegetable gardens that I had been studying, but now it is where they're building buildings. And so the residents, however, wanted space to grow plants, even in the redesign. The people who'd long lived there, who will continue to live there, the residents of social housing. So they advocated for it, and they were able at least to get some gardens included in the new design. So this is a view from Rooftop Garden. The design was amended to accommodate the material requirements of the plants. So soil and space to grow, essentially on the top of this garden. This is a Toronto Community Housing building. That's the public housing building, one of them with the rooftop gardens. So let me explain in more detail how this came about. The redevelopment reduced access to gardening. Conversely, making room for growing food was central to the vision for the redevelopment. So how so? How does this work? Well, the Toronto Community Housing Corporation consulted the community before the project began. And from this, they created a social development plan that guided the redevelopment. And the plan endorsed community gardens. So recommendation 5 and 6 of 75 recommendations identified community gardens as a priority for residents. So by the time I showed up in Regent Park, 2/3 of the new neighborhood had been constructed, and gardens remained a key feature of the area. Space to grow food-producing plants had been incorporated both in the building design and the neighborhood in general. So the rooftop gardens were included so far on 3 community housing buildings. Private condos actually also had gardens included on their roofs, and there was a community garden in the big park that was created. And yet, despite these new formal growing spaces in the new area, most of the gardening in Regent Park was taking place in these last remaining spaces of the neighborhood, around the old buildings, where there was still this open space that hadn't been built on yet. So when I was there, a new crop of guerrilla gardens, and that's what you see in this photo, these guerrilla gardens appeared. They were claimed spaces for food production. So how is this an example of plant agency? Well, Lagun writes, plants create opportunities and constraints for action. Lagun studies the commercial apple industry, and finds that the ways that apples grow, the way they look and taste, fundamentally determines how the industry works. The agency of the apple is manifested through their impact on production systems. In Regent Park, plant agency was manifested via the human-plant relationship. So firstly, the interspecies relationships provided the opportunity to design a neighborhood where plants were allocated scarce space. This involved the plants in the socio-political processes of the neighborhood. The plants claimed space to grow. They claim the space through their provisioning relationships with the gardeners. Plants need space to grow, and they claim the space. And so there's this tension at the heart of any urban agriculture project, especially in the gentrifying city, because if you plant food in the city, you take space away from another use, probably parking or building. But the material requirements of the plants for this space led people to advocate for gardens. And this advocacy was supported by the plants themselves. So their physical presence here in these gardens and their relationships with gardeners was recognized in the social development plan. So that summer of my fieldwork, these guerrilla gardens appeared. They became protest spaces where people and plants claimed land and made a statement about the redevelopment and who holds the right to plant food in the city in the first place. So this collaboration was a case of what Bailing and Surya Narayanan call interspecies resistance. So it's the posthumanist lens that makes visible the plants as actors. I also argue that they are health supporting actors, and that's because the plants offer health services to humans in exchange for soil, for watering, for weeding. The plants of Regent Park, they demonstrate how non-humans can be health actors, co-producing the conditions for health and influencing the way people live. So it was in this way that plants were imbricated in socio-political processes. And this view supports a view of health as a relational process, as opposed to a status. So health is not something that I possess. Rather, health is constantly being produced by relationships of all sorts at many scales in society. I'm now exploring non-human agency and health in the microbiome and commodity supply chains, and I'm looking forward to presenting on those new projects in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you. That was fascinating. I took lots of notes on food and on the politics of food. And this is one of the most interesting subjects, I think, for post-human philosophy as well. In terms of Mitch was just saying that he wants to have some room for questions, so I'm going to limit my comments right now. Nick Fox is going to be presenting for us on climate change, and he'll be giving us his title in a second. But he's one of the UK's leading proponents of new materialist and post-human social theory as applied to sociology, with books like The Body and the groundbreaking now and well-cited Sociology and New Materialism that he wrote, co-authored with Pam Aldred, published through Brunel University, London. And he's written widely on new materialist theory and sexualities, health and environment, and research methods. He's published over 70 peer-reviewed papers. He's been invited to be speaker at major conferences like the Hellenic Sociological Association, the British Sociological Association Medical Sociology Conference, University of Melbourne Gender and Research Conference, and the Korean Society for Social Theory. And Nick, and this is also, I believe Pam is involved with this one as well, so she's sitting by the side there to talk about a paper today on climate change, environmental justice, and the unusual capacities of post-humans. Thank you, Nick. Take it away. Thank you.
Right, I'm hoping that you can now see my slides. Can you see my slides?
Yeah, but oh, yes.
Yes.
Good.
Perfect.
Well, good morning, bonjour, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Well, thanks for inviting me to speak today in this wonderful seminar. My co-author, as Mickey says, Professor Pam Aldred from Nottingham Trent University, is here today as well. So in this paper, we're going to use insights from post-human and new materialist ontology to theorize and develop a perspective that draws together issues of sustainable development, environmental justice, and social inequalities. We draw upon feminist, materialist, and post-human scholars who argue for the affectivity or vitality of all matter, and upon non-Western and indigenous ontologies that acknowledge more than human agency. These insights will establish a post-human ecological perspective that sees human bodies as fully integral to the environment, while incorporating a sense of responsibility towards something more than human. Instead, we shall promote an understanding of sustainability as ecological potential. We also critique the terms human and humanity as aggregations that gloss over diversity and inequalities, and we will speak instead of post-humans. And this leads us to explore the unusual capacities of some post-humans and how these capacities can contribute to sustainable development. For the past 30 years, sustainable development has become an explicit objective within policy initiatives on topics including housing, food, transport, employment, and energy. Typically, it's been predicated upon the needs and desires of current and future human generations. For instance, this slide shows the definition of sustainable development in the 1987 Brundtland Report of the World Commission on Environment and Development, which is so widely cited and quoted all the time. 2 decades on, the World Health Organization's Millennium Ecosystem Assessment stated that its aim was, and I quote, to assess the consequences of ecosystem change for human well-being and establish the scientific basis for actions needed to enhance the conservation and sustainable use of those systems so that they can continue to supply the services that underpin all aspects of human life. There's also a strong sense of what has been called human exceptionalism within sustainable development policy. For instance, the 5th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, which was produced in 2014, argued that human well-being depends on economic, social, and environmental sustainability. This, the report argues, contrasts humans with all other living entities that rely solely on environmental sustainability. These policies and the actions they spawn set humans apart from, or perhaps even above, the environment, both in terms of needs and rights. But from a new materialist and post-humanist perspective, we see this exceptionalism as founded on 2 foundational flaws. The first is the dualist premise that human matter is in some ways essentially and qualitatively distinct from other matter. The second derives from the aggregations implied by terms such as human, humanity, and human rights. Such terminology glosses over the sheer diversity and multiplicity of capacities of individual bodies and downplays the inequalities between human bodies in contemporary capitalist and neoliberal societies. The new materialisms are a diverse range of approaches, but this slide summarizes some commonalities. First, the new materialisms are relational. They consider materialities such as human bodies, animals, and inanimate matter not as essential entities with pre-existing and fixed attributes, but as fully relational, with contingent and variable capacities and dispositions that emerge only when assembling with other materialities. Second, they are post-anthropocentric. They treat all matter, both human and non-human, in these assemblages as possessing capacities to affect or to be affected by other matter, as Sarah has just been discussing in relationship to plant matter. Human agency is no longer the prime mover, nor is it the principal concern. And finally, new materialist ontology is monist. It replaces structure agency, mind matter, culture, nature, and many other dualisms that are so central to sociology with a flat ontology that regards the endless daily interactions between human and non-human matter rather than the top-down exercise of power or social structure or ideology as the sole producer of history and the social world. So for the feminist and critical social theorist Rosie Braidotti, the justification for a more than human perspective lies in the recognition that the interests of humans are not divorced from the interests of other living things and of the physical earth. Moving beyond both humanism and anti-humanism, Braidotti instead establishes a post-human project in which matter and culture are not dialectically opposed. This understanding of post-humanism supplies Braidotti with the basis for an eco-philosophy that establishes a continuum between human and non-human matter, and a post-human ethics based on a new sense of interconnectedness between human and non-human. New materialists such as Jane Bennett proclaim the liveliness and affectivity of all matter. Bennett talks of thing power, or in other words, the capacity to affect and be affected, associated with all materiality. In this post-human eco-philosophy, non-human materialities are, to quote Bennett, bona fide participants rather than recalcitrant objects, social constructs, or instrumentalities within events and interactions. And the environment is not simply the context for human agency, but the arena for the production of the entirety of both natural and social worlds. There is nothing beyond the environment, and nothing, for instance, humans and their diverse cultures, excluded from it. A post-human position also reveals the category of human and the concept of humanity as part of a darker side to humanism. Such terms obscure the diversity of different genders, races, incomes, abilities, nationalities, and the inequalities between them. Historically, this privileging of an aggregated humanity has led to both the socio-economic inequalities between global North and South and the degradation of the non-human environment, including the current climate crisis. Post-human ontology and ethics incorporates a concern with social justice to challenge these inequities, while policies to address climate change must also address climate justice. To mark out this critical recognition of diversity in inequalities, for the rest of this talk, we refer to posthumans. What we term a posthuman is an assemblage of biological, socio-cultural, and environmental elements whose capacities to affect and be affected are specific to its setting, circumstances, and relations with other matter. A post-human analysis weaves together these threads of justice and sustainability, emphasizing the connectedness of post-human and non-human materialities, and acknowledging the diversity and multiplicity of post-humans. A post-human politics addresses the mutual dependency of post-human and non-human capacities. It evaluates any event, that is a specific assemblage of post-human and non-human materialities, in terms of the breadth of possibilities it produces in its constituent relations, including, once again, referencing Sarah's paper just now, concepts such as health. Environmental policy in this post-human perspective will aim to enhance the capacities of both non-human and post-human. It will neither privilege post-humans over other matter, nor privilege the capacities of rich, white, global North post-humans over others. This post-human politics of environment establishes the foundations for an alternative understanding of sustainabilities as ecological potential, challenging a narrow model of sustainability tied to human lives and future human generations. This alternative view focuses not upon stable attributes and continuities of human or non-human matter, but upon the capacities and potential of assemblages of post-humans and other matter. It moves beyond the usual narrow focus in the social sciences on human potential to acknowledge the capacity of all matter, non-human as well as human, to become other. Sustainable development in this perspective should seek ways to enhance the capacities and becomings of all elements of the assemblage, while ensuring these becomings do not place human capacities in opposition to those of other materialities. So posthumans are no longer ontologically separate from the environment, but instead fully integral alongside other animate and inanimate elements. What sustains the environment can also be emancipatory for posthumans. So I'd argue that this ontology dissolves the anthropocentric exceptionalism that has underpinned the UN's sustainable development policy for so long, while not denying the importance of addressing social and economic inequalities. The post-human ethical commitment must be instead to promote those actions that can enhance the environments and hence human potentialities, and moderate those that would limit that potential, be that by exhausting natural resources, filling the atmosphere with greenhouse gases, or limiting post-human possibilities through poverty, economic inequalities, or threats to health. So I'm edging towards a conclusion now. This ethics of environmental sustainability translates into assessments of how actions enable or constrain environmental becoming. Enabling actions include reducing greenhouse gas emissions and plastic waste, or providing clean water to enhance post-human health. Constraining actions, by contrast, will include exploiting natural resources such as heavy metals for economic gain, clearing forests for agriculture, or undercutting local food production with cheap imports that increase social and economic inequalities and injustices. However, this does not mean ignoring the variety and range of post-human capacities. In the closing pages of her book, Vibrant Matter, Jane Bennett challenges the arguments of some environmentalists that post-humans should aim simply to tread lightly on the earth. Sometimes, she argues, environmental becoming may need grander, more dramatic and violent expenditures of human energy, to quote her. Building on this, we need to acknowledge that post-humans possess some unusual capacities. These include the capacity to use reason to theorize, predict, or anticipate future or unseen events, to act altruistically towards unknown others, to imagine the future and create technologies to deliver it. Alongside all the material capacities of non-human elements of the environment, these unusual capacities can be added to the mix. And we suggest that these post-human capacities are actually now essential to address the current anthropogenic climate change crisis. This acknowledgement does not mark a return to a humanist reprivileging of human agency or reason, however. Instead, it fully recognizes an environment that is endlessly emerging, changing, fragmenting, and fracturing. By developing and activating the full range of post-human and non-human capacities at our disposal, we can establish an environment assemblage that is vital, self-organizing, and emergent. With these recognitions, we arrive at our concluding remarks. In this paper, we've asserted a post-humanist understanding of sustainability as ecological potential. It's been based on two propositions: the post-anthropocentric acknowledgement of the relational vitality of all matter, and an ethics of environment that fosters matter's potential for becoming. These two features of a post-humanist perspective overcome shortcomings in current approaches to sustainability. On one hand, they broaden the conception of sustainable development beyond the humanist prioritization of the well-being of current and future generations of humans. On the other, a post-human perspective rejects anti-humanist arguments that to protect the environment, the human footprint on the earth must be radically reduced, despite the social and economic consequences for particular groups of post-humans, such as the poor and those in the global south. However, we have also argued that a post-humanist perspective on sustainable development does not mean stepping back from the environment, but integrating fully within it. An ethics of environment that focuses on matter's potential for becoming requires employing all available capacities, including those of posthumans. Given where we are now, a planet already substantively degraded by anthropogenic pollution and the effects of burning carbon fuels, action is urgent and must be radical. Though it may seem paradoxical, given the state to which human agency has brought the environment and the climate, a substantive investment of posthumans' unusual capacities must now urgently be deployed. So that's it. The following slide provides the reference to a version of this talk shortly to be published, and a couple of other recent papers by Professor Aldred and myself. We're just waiting for the paper on which today's talk was based to be published in the Journal of Human Rights and Environment. But thank you so much for listening today.
This big round of applause for everybody all around. Thank you, Nick, and thank you for yourself and Pam too. Keep always writing and publishing. It's very, very motivating to see how much you have always. And Mitch was just telling us that possible we might have a very limited time for questions. So even though I took piles and piles of very enthusiastic notes about everybody's stuff, I want to, instead of giving a kind of a synthesis talk, which is what I wanted to do originally, I was wondering if it was possible to move right over to the guests. I'm not sure how this works, Christine or David, for questions. Are you able to help moderate for questions there? Mitch, David, or Christine?
Yes, so on the live stream, there is a box for questions to be asked, and I can monitor that and read the questions to the presenters. This is how this seems to be working. So, yes, so just for the attendees, if you do have a question or comment for one of the presenters, please use the question box and I will be monitoring this. So we had a question right after Andrew's paper, and this is a question from Brigitte Kirsteiner. And she was asking, what is exactly the materiality of noise? Is it not just another symbolic category like gender, race, or etc.? A category that would be constructed by interpretation?
That's a great question. Thank you so much. I mean, I think there's two ways to kind of think about that, and I was trying to kind of think through the two different figurings of noise, and one would be that it is a subjective category that can be imposed on things, a distinction between sound and noise, where noise is often used in as a kind of subjective description of that which is a kind of aberrant sonicity, I suppose. So that would be one way. Against that kind of reading of noise, I'm trying to kind of think about noise as vibration, right? So noise as vibration, that would be the kind of matter of noise. That would be the kind of the materiality of noise. And when we think about noise in vibrational terms, we're kind of thinking about the kind of movement of the world. We're thinking about the kind of the relation between things in the world that is producing movement, producing difference, producing transformation. So I think that's, for me, the kind of materiality is to kind of move against the kind of simply sonic reading of noise and to think about it always in vibrational terms as a kind of something that is connected to a particular type of materiality and a particular type of materiality that is surrounding us, and generative of difference, always generative of difference. Again, not to say that the difference is always liberatory or always positive. It can kind of form into and concretize into messages or formations that are, reactionary or singular, and yet there is, if we kind of return to that materiality of noise, we're always returning to a kind of vibrational possibility, a field of possibility, a field of difference, a field of generativity. So that would be the kind of materialist reading of noise against a kind of against a more subjective and surface reading of noise as simply sonic material that is contrary to what we might think of as sound, or where sound signifies meaning and noise signifies non-meaning, I suppose.
Great. There is a follow-up question. I should also say there were a few thanks in the question box that I didn't publish all of them, but thanks to the presenters for the rich papers. Maya is asking as a follow-up, how do you frame the noise of the indigenous, so chants, music, war cries, as opposed to colonial noise?
Yeah, and another great question, and I don't want to speak, as a non-Indigenous, as a settler living here, I don't want to speak on behalf of or for any kind of Indigenous reading of noise. One thing I'm trying to do in this talk is to kind of think about the kind of history or what is in colonial archives in terms of a dismissal of indigeneity through its noisiness, right? An idea that noise is equated to primitivity and savagery, and that becomes a way of reading certain racialized subjects, Indigenous people, and other non-white subjects and other racialized subjects as non-self-possessed subjects, non-transcendental subjects, non-rational subjects. And so then that kind of becoming part of a justification for the imposition of what is perceived to be kind of order, civility. So the kind of imposition of order and civility is kind of positioned as a kind of sound against the noise, right? So when we have those acts of claiming possession, the firing of muskets, the beating of drums, the fanfare of trumpets, that's imagined, I think, to be these signifiers of sound, these signifiers of order and progress against what is often kind of written in colonial archives as a kind of noisiness of savagery and uncivility. So I'm sort of interested in the way that noise becomes a kind of subjective category in those accounts of the colonial world-making project that serve and work to kind of uphold this, that become part of the rationalization for dispossession, and that underpin, they form a kind of aesthetic component to conceptions of subjectivity, as well as what become these sort of legal fictions like Terra Nullius, right?
Okay, great. It's also a space for participants to ask questions from one another, and I see that Pam has a question for Sarah. Pam, did you want to go ahead and ask your question?
I loved your paper, Sarah. Well, I really enjoyed all the papers, and thanks for bringing them together, Mickey. That was great. I'd love to ask Sarah to talk about her method more, and whether there were any challenges or struggles in bringing together multiple accounts, trying to do something wider than a humanist ethnography. So I'd love to hear about that as a method.
Thanks, Pam. Yes, there were challenges. I spent the first part of the study really I'm trying to understand agency, the non-human agency. And as someone who really is interested in political questions, that was a struggle, because I would go to the garden, for example, on a Tuesday, and work. I'm speaking specifically of the Regent Park Garden. Go on a Tuesday morning, and then come back on Thursday morning, and oh, the zucchini has obviously grown across is reaching across the garden bed. And then I'm like, so what? What does that matter? How do I connect all these politics around me with the non-human agency of the zucchini plant or the kale plant or the tomatoes? Like, and it wasn't until it was something I was really struggling with, and trying to make those political connections, because I was at the same time I was going to go to a community meeting about what's going to happen next in the redevelopment, and talking to people about how they're losing land. So how do I reconcile what the zucchini growing with all these human politics? And then one day I decided to, on a pure whim, cycle around the neighborhood and map all these guerrilla gardens, because they really just sort of popped up around these. Like I wasn't aware of them, and suddenly they were there. So I thought, okay, I should map them. I'm not a geographer. So that was a strange move. But anyway, I mapped the gardens, and it was when I looked at scale, that was the click moment of my project. Oh, when I see all these plants operating together as a collective, and luckily this is supported, this idea of plants as a collective is supported in the literature. When I saw these plants, when I mapped them as a collective in the neighborhood, then their agency was suddenly visible to me. The vegetal politics of these plants became clear. So I really see, and now I'm thinking about these ideas in the context of produce supply chains, I really see that scale is really important, and the idea of the individual plant's agency, in my view, wasn't as important as what are all those plants doing together. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, that's really interesting. So a sort of multiplicity garden rather than plant level, or yeah, that's lovely. Mm-hmm. Go on.
Oh, sorry, or no, even communities across gardens, because people would share plants or share seeds. So the plants in one garden could be connected to the plants maybe 500 meters away, but to get like at so many different levels, and like genetically, pollinators connecting them, people connecting them, food waste, anyway, many connections. And so it was like a real relational agency at that level too.
And have you written specifically about your method somewhere?
Yes, there's a paper in Environmental Humanities on my on the method. This question.
Lovely, thanks.
Thank you. Nick has a question.
Yeah, I'm actually, it's for Sarah as well. It's a sort of follow up to what Pam was just asking. But it struck me that, I mean, I speak as a very keen gardener myself, but is it not the case that gardens and agriculture generally are the sort of colonialism of the plant world? And I wonder if you to what extent you think about what plants can do that we have no idea about, because we only ever take a human perspective, and maybe there's an awful lot more to the plant world which we need to be open to, rather than simply the way that humans have exploited them.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a wonderful question. I think that speaks to when I said, the struggles of defining posthumanism and decentering the human. When I'm interested in politics, how much am I decentering the human? And so I do see, my human interests are imbricated in my research topic because I can't separate. I'm interested in the politics. So if we take the human away, if we take the plant out of society and look at it and at all its wonderful things, absolutely. In my private life, I love to learn about those aspects of plants. But I think as a scholar, I really am fascinated by the political questions, and so that is what I'm interested in. Your gardens as colonial, though, that is a very good point. Like the normative space of the garden, that's also something I had to wrestle with, because the relational agency in the garden could be expressed in a good garden and a pretty garden. Well, what is a good garden? Who makes it good? What makes a nice looking garden versus a not nice one, or a productive garden, a not nice one? In another part of my project, I did look at the food plants that like food mobility. So the mobile plants of people with roots to the global south are planting certain vegetables in gardens here in Toronto to keep their to foodways and to achieve food sovereignty. And those partnerships with plants in terms of in food sovereignty and sort of like that following the paths of empire with the seeds to Toronto to grow foods that were important when they lived elsewhere. So that's that's how I play around with the colonial theme, I suppose, a little bit. But yes, the garden can be a very normative space, but not always. Thank you.
I'll abuse my power to maybe make a comment, and I know that Mickey has questions, so maybe he wants to follow up my comment here. But and it's one thing that could be addressed by all presenters, I guess. It's this idea of distributing agency or recognizing that there is agentic capacity well beyond the human and of all kinds. But Nick in his presentation was of ontology, and so because we're distributing agency, there's a flatness that is introduced in our world in some way. And some people argue along those lines, but I think what I've heard everybody talk about today is a huge differential in the power of this agentic capacity, and one that is not in favor of the human. So just a comment here, because when we talk about plants and what they do, when we talk about ecosystems, right, in regards to sustainability, or if we consider noise and the types of noise and whatnot, right? So it seems to me that the power lays elsewhere, which is probably what makes it distressing for humans to think about. But so just a comment, and I don't know if Mickey, you wanted to follow up on that, or if you wanted to let our presenters say something about this.
No, I'm just kind of redesigning my question to reflect your insights. But I'm happy to let others speak. I do have one question that I'd like to save for after, because I think it's tangentially related. But I'd love to hear from others. Where did Nick go? Okay. Well, you know what? Maybe he got disconnected or something, and we'll let him get back on. But okay, well, I'll take your question. I'll take it and take a left turn or a right turn, depending on what you think of the question. I mean, it reminds me of, I mean, this question of the agency of the post-human, you know, or of the not the post-human, but of the non-human, reminds me very much of the of time objects, right? Like agency, and you know, from what I can see, like if we're going to get into the question of agency, it's a question of anticipation. But the question of anticipation presumes that there's a certain kind of time object in place where we have a past and a present and a future to come. But how do we absorb the perspectives of entities whose senses of time are so radically different from human organizations of time? I read recently that the only natural process, one of the few natural processes in the universe that have a sense of time that's similar to humans, is the law of thermodynamics, which is that entropy goes towards a future, right? And so, I mean, it's interesting that we're in a stage now of you know, of a warming planet, where the planet is taking the form of this sort of, you know, for lack of a better term, I don't want the implications of this, but the planet is kind of a superhuman in the sense that it does have this destination towards entropy. But you know, when it comes down to, you know, like Nick's work, I'll more concentrate on Nick if he's able to reconnect. Is how do we imagine times that align more with non-human entities? Or I can redirect it towards Sarah and towards Andrew, which is that, you know, like like consuming food is a time object as well, in a sense, and it's a you know, it's not just a question of you know, what foods are included. It's like how we segregate bodies when we consume food is something like of the time we take and the time we take to create a sustainability. But maybe sustainability is in some of your work, Sarah, and maybe Andrew, maybe sustainability is in some of your work as well with murmurs and with noise, you know. But I mean, there's a lot of flirtation lately in, you know, in kind of resuscitating the works of Bergson or Whitehead, who are looking at these sort of alternate definitions of time, or like time as duration, or Whitehead, time as causal efficacy, which is, you know, the body always taking in sensation, like not the bundle of sensation of David Hume, but just the bundle, right? So, I mean, how do we, maybe one of the questions that's underlying this, and it's a rhetorical question, is how do we reimagine sustainability so that it accommodates all of the other senses of time that are possibly non-existent for the rest of nature, as problematic as that term might be? Or maybe Pam, I could direct this towards you, since you're writing so much on sustainability. And I'll put you on the spot.
It's a great question. Sarah or Pam, did you want to lead this off, or?
I got bumped out for a little bit too, so I only heard a little bit of what Mickey said. So better if you go, Andrew.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really great question. You know, I'm certainly interested in that kind of entropic possibility, right? That kind of movement towards something interruptive, generative, something that is, in a sense, you know, has a kind of is that expression of difference that offers us a way of moving towards possibility, to moving towards unknownness. I suppose in my work, I'm quite interested in that relationship, that sort of processual understanding of time, a durational understanding of time, the way it relates to a question of something like entropy or chaos, generativity and difference, these kinds of ideas. But I'm equally interested in a kind of historical materialist kind of conception of temporality too, I suppose. So I'm interested in the way in which material conditions and, you know, economic structures and systems produce the conditions for things. You know, I'm interested, I suppose, in a couple of temporalities. I'm interested particularly in the kind of crisis that gets underway from the 1970s onwards, the kind of oil crisis and the process of deindustrialization that happens from there, the kind of moment in which we move into a capital moves from a kind of mode of production to a more circulatory phase in which we enter these recurring and cyclical crises. And so I'm interested in what happens there structurally and economically, and very, you know, very much a kind of human agential sets of decisions and sets of structures and systems that produce and shape the way a set of entropic conditions unfold. You know, I think we can connect the decades of riots that we've seen over the last more than 10 years now, kind of going back to sort of the 2010s, the recurrence of the riot as a form of dissent and a form of struggle to those longer economic conditions, what we might call the kind of long crisis or the long decline. And I'm thinking here of someone like Joshua Clover's really fantastic work on this, or Robert Brennan's work on the kind of long decline, and tracking this, the way a set of material conditions produce a set of more spontaneous and entropic expressions that are collective and unpredictably agential, I suppose. So I'm interested in that, in those two, in these ways of kind of holding multiple temporalities or multiple understandings of temporality. I'm very interested in the kind of materialist conditions and the kind of historically materialist conditions in a sort of Marxist sense. What produces the conditions for crisis, and that is always a kind of question of studying human agency and human decision making, and I'm interested in holding that against the more unpredictable and generative conceptions of time, and the way that then implies a whole set of non-human forces as well, right? We can think about climate change as something that is produced by rampant industrialism and the colonial world-making project, and yet then we're kind of swept up in a set of processes that are far beyond our own agency. And so there's something for me productive in thinking about the kind of two conceptions of, or two lenses for thinking about temporality and transformation over time, I suppose.
No, it's interesting in that response. And Nick, welcome back. I hear the weather of the rural internet would possibly cut you out there for a sec. But it was just at the cusp. I was asking a question, and Andrew was filling in brilliantly there for a second. I was just talking about, we were just thinking in your presentation about sustainability as a time object, and thinking about how time, or the sense of time where the past is ordered, that now is, kind of a general sense of now, more of like a multiple nows, many nows happening, like all of our nows are happening in different nows, but we're all generally, there's a consensus that a now is happening, and that there is an uncertain future, which we're using, knowledge of the past in order to make sense of for then. But that particular sense of time, like time on a timeline, is a pretty human-centric kind of sense of time. And so if we're, like, and this was one of the things I was reading your stuff on policy. I think we had a bit of an email exchange about policy, and like how do you reconcile this, such a radically different notion of time in sustainability for a post-human framework, or what steps are you taking to work through that, or that I haven't read yet?
Yeah, I mean, it makes absolutely no sense to really, the concept of sustainability is entirely an anthropocentric concept, because the universe doesn't stay still, it's continually changing, and there is no sustainability. I mean, we probably, it started off as a kind of singularity and have been expanding for the last 13 billion years, and will then start to contract and go back to a singularity. Nothing will stay the same. The Earth will be entirely consumed when the sun goes supernova. So it makes very little sense. And I think the whole problem of the United Nations approach has been to hang on to that very, very narrow window of thinking about effectively the last couple of thousand years of Western civilization as the way to think through these things. So we really have to move away from that. And I mean, what I tried to suggest by using terms such as becoming rather than being is that fact that there is continual change. And so, I mean, in a sense, time is something which has been invented in order to explain the changeability of events. And there's one event that follows over another. And so Western philosophy has come up with the concept of time to explain that, and why things change, and also how to desperately try to keep them the same. So, I mean, those are some sort of random thoughts off my head. Yes, it was the weather that blew out my broadband just now. So I'm sorry to have missed that, but I don't know if that's at all coherent, what I've just said.
Absolutely. I mean, it's like non-human time interrupts our sense of time, or a human sense of time, which goes right back to Michel Serres, and I never say his name right, but Michel Serres and Andrew Brooks' comment on the was it that shifting? What's it called there again, Andrew? What's the Lucretius? What?
The Klineman.
Right. that impossible move from order into disorder. But it's this, like, what we think of as being interrupted time is this, it's like a patchwork of these non-human times that are unpredictable forces of nature, or whatever way we have it. Like, it's very easy to think about, it's very easy to think without objects, but it's very hard to think without time. And so I can see this as being like one of the at least today, I feel like is one of the biggest hurdles to sort of to talk through. You know, not to say there's a solution, but at least to even talk through. And I think that's more pushing the edges, like the edges of the empirical at that point. And I really appreciate everybody's presentations today, and I'm glad this worked out so well. Christine, it's getting on 2:45, and I'm being
and I
time.
Yes, it is time indeed. So thank you, everyone. Thanks for organizing this, Mickey. These were really rich papers and a rich conversation. Apologies again for the technical glitches at the beginning. This is why we extended the session by 15 minutes. And for those of you who would like to listen again, watch again, we will be posting the recording on our YouTube channel, probably sometime next week. So thanks again to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks so
you.
much.
It's been fantastic. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.